live, I take it. I'll have to take that on faith because all kinds of really silly little things. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. This is the weekly question and answer stream on the Bridges of Meaning Discord. This is a lot of fun. I was just talking to Rick this morning about we don't seem to exhaust the questions or the conversation, so we'll keep doing this. But I said, it would be fun to have guests on sometimes too. John Van Donk was just in town. He wanted to go out for breakfast. I said, I'm busy doing this. He said, I'll come on the show. I said, well, it's a little hard for me and Rick to set it up. But I had talked to Benjamin Boyce about this. Others have commented on Jonathan Peugeot coming on sometime. So it would be fun to do some guest shows with some question and answer and some conversation. I don't know if we do that Friday morning, if that would be instead of. So any feedback you have about that, that would be fine. But let's get to maybe I'll do what I've done before for you early birds that got into the voice chat. If anybody wants to sneak a question in before I read the question from last time, this is your shot.
Hey, Paul, it's James.
Hey, James, how are you?
Good.
Good.
I wanted to ask you to clarify something for me because I watched you talk about it in one of your videos and it has great importance to me. You stated that you don't think pastoral care is therapy. Could you distinguish the two, and could you tell me more about what pastoral care is?
Oh, that's a great question. I have a friend who is a Christian and he's a therapist, and actually we were just talking about this yesterday because he's done a lot of thinking about that. He's another guy I'd really like to have on the channel. I actually did a convo with him at one point, but I think about you a lot, James, when I talk to him. Maybe the three of us can have a conversation sometime. Okay, so back to the question. The goal of therapy, as I understand it, so James is a member of our local meetup here. He teaches psychology at a local community college, and I've learned a ton from James. He's been on the channel. And so, James, feel free to jump in and talk to me about this, or if you have any yeah buts. But my initial take is basically this. The modern therapeutic paradigm is foundationally secular. And for that reason, the orientation of it was lovingly teased out in the great show The Sopranos, where Dr. Melfi has to try to figure out if she should make Tony Soprano better so he can continue to be a thug, a mob boss. Because the paradigm of therapy is, let's use the word well-being, and well-being is managed as this is, we want you to feel better. And that's not a bad thing. That's in fact not a bad, let's call it, internal gyroscope for a lot of good things. Generally speaking, if people feel better, they've got greater capacity for generosity, for morality, for being good to their spouses, for raising their children well, for being productive people at work. So as things go, a sense of well-being and feeling well is a good thing. That is a little different from pastoral care, where my job as a pastor is to hopefully help you align your story and your character and your being with that of Jesus Christ. So that's the skinny. And myself and my therapist friend talked about that a little bit yesterday because, well, and again, I'll just use the Dr. Melfi, Tony Soprano example. Is it moral for Dr. Melfi to help Tony Soprano be able to whack someone and not have post-traumatic stress? Or is it outside the box of a therapist to say, Tony, you probably wouldn't have as much trauma in your life if you'd get another job? And he'd say, hey, what can I say? This is who I am. Help me get better, doctor. So, and of course, in terms of Tony Soprano and Dr. Melfi, how do you figure that out? Because a lot of, the first season, a lot of Tony Soprano's stuff was A lot of Tony Soprano's stuff was issues with his marriage. Well, issues with his marriage again draw back to issues with his job. So I don't know, James, what do you think? That's my initial take. I'd love to hear your thoughts.
I was hoping to maybe pose this question to you. What would you say to somebody who is open to therapy, going to see a psychologist, but is, and this is, let's say, a Christian person, but they're resistant to pastoral care?
I would want to ask them why. And I would imagine that at least at a low resolution level in our culture, they probably are resistant to pastoral care because they're expecting the pastor to lean on them in a moral direction that they don't want to be leaned on. So there's a, let's use the example of, let's say someone is coming in and they're going to church, and let's say they're living with their girlfriend, and the pastor says gently, that's probably not, for a whole lot of different reasons, that's probably not the best thing for you. And what often happens in cases like this is someone basic doesn't use these words, but certainly could. I don't, Pastor, you can take your stinking ideas of morality and, shove them where the sun don't shine because, I'm, and a conversation I had with another pastor recently, we imagine that pastors, well, if you want to know what God thinks about my situation, talk to the pastor and the pastor will tell me. By the time people talk to a pastor, they already believe that they've heard from God, and they're just looking for a pastor to agree with them and support them in whatever decision they make. And so the church is morally conflicted and has a degree of moral authority and moral annoyance that if you go to a secular therapist, right now the paradigm of secular therapy is they're not going to suggest that maybe you shouldn't sleep with your girlfriend. They're not going to suggest that, they're not going to lean with a morality, or at least not an upfront morality on that. But again, part of what Dr. Melfi and Tony Soprano illustrate is that even a secular therapeutic relationship has an implicit morality that is being exerted, and there are often some tensions between that and various other religious moralities.
Can I jump in, or?
Sure.
As a training psychotherapist, I would agree with that. Like most therapists aren't going to say, most therapists aren't going to be as concerned with, or secular therapists aren't going to be concerned with your sexual habits as much as, say, a Christian therapist might be. But a more nuanced take would, or a more nuanced psychotherapist may say something like, more nuanced, even secular. Or if I was a therapist and a Christian, which I will be, I may say to a secular person something like, consider the reasons behind, the reason for regardless of the metaphysical truth of the Bible, consider the cultural, social, and just cultural and social and physical consequences of sleeping with someone before marriage. Like there's the potential for a kid, there's a potential for STDs, there's a potential for all these other things that I won't list off here, but these things need to be taken into account when you're taking into consideration how you want your future child to be raised. And no one wants or expects to have a kid when, like, say they wear a condom, but those things do happen sometimes. So yeah.
Sounds like you're Jesus smuggling in the secular therapist.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, you're treading on dangerous ground there.
Well, Well, what do you mean? Try to. I understand what you mean. I heard what's his face say, "Don't Jesus smuggle in the same hair as Peterson" debate, but
Well,
um,
and so someone says, no, because they somehow, sort of pierce the four walls and they find out that this person who hasn't advertised themselves as a Christian therapist actually is a Christian. And then they go to their girlfriend and they said, my therapist suggested that maybe us not having sexual relations is, that's an issue. And well, I'm smelling some Christianity in your therapist. And
right.
so, there's a lot of issues in here that 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 come up.
Is that something that would be? I would understand like why so a secular person would be dissuaded by a Christian perspective and not like that they didn't reveal that in that particular case, but
Well,
um,
there's all these. So I was before. The reason Rick and I are always not starting on time is because Rick has such interesting stories to tell me. And so Rick and I are talking this morning, and he mentions that apparently in the news there's a story about a woman in Sacramento who is, I don't remember the name of this site, but it's like only something only. But anyway, she is doing pornography on this site, and
right.
her husband he's the photographer,
Jeez.
and she has kids in Catholic school, and the
Wow.
Catholic school wants to basically, you know, kick out her kids from Catholic school. And okay, so,
Naturally.
so what would someone comes to the therapist and says, "Gosh, I got all this stress because I got all this stress because I'm making 150 grand a month doing this business. Who's gonna challenge me doing 150 grand a month?"
Right.
Now, what does the secular therapist say, and what does the Christian pastor say? So then I said to Rick, I said, "Yeah, imagine, Rick, if this woman starts coming to our church. What do we do? What do we do? What do we say?" Now, first of all, in my church, probably nobody would know that she's doing that, and but how does and then so okay, so everything's great between her and her husband right now, and she's on major media bragging about how this helps their intimacy. And I, as a pastor, sort of roll my eyes and think, this is naive, short-sighted. Um, just this, there's 1,000 different ways that this is going to go wrong, and this might seem like a real short-term, cool way to make money, but I don't
Right.
think it's sustainable. I don't think it's good for your family. And at least a piece of that isn't just, let's say, secular wisdom, but a piece of that is the guidance of Christian morality. So, so then these two go into a therapist for marriage counseling. And
Right.
they,
Secular. Correct.
yeah, well, either or. They go into a Christian therapist. The Christian therapist is probably going to say, you probably need a new job. The secular therapist, what are they going to say? They might say you need a new job because there are secular reasons and secular wisdom that says this probably isn't a great strategy for a marriage. But the secular therapist is going to have to sort of be tiptoeing around a bunch of these issues because the secular therapist is probably not going to, come out against pornography or anything like that.
Right. Right. Yeah.
So,
Um. Uh. J- James. Right.
yeah, James.
James. You asked or mentioned. What did you say? I can't remember exactly what you said. Did you say what? Why would someone see a psychotherapist but not a pastor?
Yeah, that was his question.
Yeah,
So,
that was what I asked.
from my perspective, um, it seems to me like because I do this when going to my pastors. I go in. I don't anymore, but this is something I used to do. I used to go in expecting them because I've been studying psychology on and off for 5 or 6 years, and I go in expecting them to know all of these things, and they just aren't trained in psychology. They are very intuitive about a lot of things, but they don't know the specifics of how this and that works. And I would go in there expecting them to know all these things, and then get frustrated because they don't know them and they don't understand exactly what I mean when I'm talking about this specific thing in psychology. So that may be a reason for resistance from a non-psychologist Christian pastor.
I want to hear. I want to hear from you, James, because James is so much fun. Let's hear it, James.
I know I'm a lot of fun to talk to, but I really don't know. I'm considering the question, and I'm glad to hear from both Daniel and you. So I really don't know.
Well, you teach psychology. Where do morality and psychology interface? Isn't it some sort of secular view of well-being?
Yeah, but you brought up something about, let's say you had a therapist who was a Christian, and they thought that something about Christianity would help the well-being of their non-Christian client. I feel like if they were authentic, they would tell that client, even if it wasn't per se Christian therapy. If it was,
right.
if they were just being authentic, and there are times during therapy to reveal things personally about oneself. It's a very powerful tool if it's used in a limited fashion, like swearing.
Kind of like selective transparency.
Yeah, when it's authentically your goal to help the patient that you're treating, sometimes disclosure like that, or just being authentic about what you think would help them, is maybe even if they don't take that advice, or if they don't take that perspective about spirituality, that might make a connection for them that you are being authentically caring, and that can aid the relationship towards their well-being anyway.
Right.
Well, it's, I sometimes play these games when I think the Apostle Paul walks into a therapist's office and says, gosh, before that road to Damascus, my life was going pretty good. I experienced a lot of meaning hunting down Christians. I had the affirmation of my community. Everything was really going well. And then I had this religious experience, or a spiritual experience on the road to Damascus, and now I'm.
I'll go get you some.
Oops, someone's got an open mic. Now I've got, all of these troubles in my life, and I travel and I visit these synagogues in Asia Minor, and I tell them that I saw Jesus and Jesus is alive. And then I basically launch church fights wherever I go. And sometimes there's mob violence, and sometimes the city officials want to stone me, and sometimes the members of the synagogue want to stone me. The therapist says their moral orientation is basically established by a sense of well-being.
Right. And well-being of mostly just, well, I can't say this from an academic standpoint because I'm just now learning, but maybe James could expand on this from a well-being standpoint of the personal client instead of the well-being of all the systems that work together to create well-being overall. Maybe is that?
I'll hop in with a little extra prompt.
I'm not a therapist, so please don't confuse me as one.
Oh, okay. Okay.
And anybody and all my Sacramento meetup crew knows that I would not be a good one.
That's hilarious. Go ahead, Joey. You wanted to jump in?
Yeah, I was going to say that it strikes me that one of the draws of Jordan Peterson is that he'll take those two fields and keep them as completely separate layers. And say when you're trying to triangulate a problem and a solution to a problem, it's best to have 2 points that are separate and not right next to each other, because that aids in triangulation. So for James and Daniel, do you think being explicit about keeping the morality separate from the mentally therapeutic, would that help somebody find, what we're calling meaning in our lives?
Yes. I think so.
But this is my issue with Jordan Peterson's meaning as gyroscope. Tony Soprano finds it very meaningful, finds his work very meaningful. The Apostle Paul finds his work very meaningful. You know, to sort of paraphrase Luther's comment about rationality, meaning is a whore. She'll work for anybody.
I've never heard that.
And that's, I think, the limitation. And I think, you know, Jordan goes deeper than that. I think you're right, Joey. Part of what makes Jordan so interesting is that he has found ways to expand, sort of following along Christian trails. He has found a way to expand the morality conversation and integrate it into the naturalistic, secularistic matrix. And, you know, a lot of what he does with that is through Piaget, through Nietzsche, through Dostoevsky, through the existentialists. So Peterson really pushes those borders and those boundaries. And so, for example, this week when he's talking to Ayaan Hirsi Ali, the woman from Somalia who went to the Netherlands, you know, Peterson he keeps pushing that envelope in questions of morality, and he keeps sort of inviting people to expand the therapeutic, psychological, moral conversation in the direction of Christian morality. And so when Jordan Peterson makes arguments against premarital cohabitation, makes arguments against certain aspects of same-sex marriage, when he makes arguments that get him into trouble in the culture war, and he's doing it from sort of a secular standpoint, but he's following let's say the wagon out here out west. In some places you can still find the ruts from the wagon wheels when, you know, the Oregon Trail people came through. You know, he's sort of following the wagon ruts of Christianity.
Right.
And this, of course, bothers people because he is trampling on this line. But part of what, I mean, before Slate Star Codex got doxxed by the New York Times, I mean, if you go back and you could find his review of 12 Rules for Life, you know, one of the things that I was really impressed by that review was there are a lot of reasons why Slate Star Codex would look at Jordan Peterson and want to hate him, and that's basically what he said. But Jordan had a lot of credibility, which is why he caught so much flack. If Jordan was a putz, he would have been easier to dismiss, but he wasn't. And so this area is, and so then it's no secret that Jordan and Sam Harris get into it, because Sam Harris basically wants to say well-being and shrug his shoulders. And Jordan's like, that's way too facile. That's way too simplistic. And it's right. And Jordan, of course, being a clinician and the other things that he's worked on, understands just how complex this question of well-being is. And the woman and her husband who are, you know, would-be successful pornographers who want to send their kids to Catholic school, that story illustrates the dynamics. And what's really interesting to me is that part of the reason the secular press understands just from the response that this is a hot story and we can all read that is because this story crosses those lines, and we all sort of know that implicitly, but not a lot of us can actually articulate why. And Jordan could. And so
I haven't even heard of that story. I just got here, but
yeah, well, I just heard it this morning from Rick. But there's a lot going on here, and that's why it's an interesting topic of conversation, because you go to the therapist and, you know, here's another thing. You go to a secular therapist and you're the patient. You're not doing marriage therapy. You're the patient. You go to a secular therapist and let's say the marriage isn't going well, and there's all kinds of reasons why you and your wife aren't getting along, and maybe you found someone else that you're getting along better with, and the therapist might say, well, why don't you consider a separation or maybe divorce, or maybe you should go after a relationship with this other person if that's perhaps where well-being is getting at. And the therapist doesn't. I don't want to draw a straw man of therapists here, but the thing is, a Christian minister is probably going to lean more heavily on preserving the integrity of the marriage and advocating for the marriage, which sort of becomes a third person in the process. So, and I think there are whole ranges of issues that come up, and they all center around this question of, okay, well-being. Is well-being really best ascertained by my individual, personal, rather temporally sensed sense of well-being? What Christian theology and mythology and narrative tends to do is expand the view. And Peterson sort of gets into that with his Piaget equilibrated self routine that he talks about, because the truth is, if you're sitting there with a patient and you help them feel better today, it's not unlike when I was in the Dominican Republic, and so check that off your bingo sheet. When I was in the Dominican Republic, regularly people would go to the doctor, and there was something wrong with them, and the doctor would prescribe, let's say, ibuprofen to deal with the fever, and maybe 2 or 3 other medications. And these Haitians were living on maybe 50 cents a day when they worked. And so they would go to the pharmacy, and there's 3 drugs they would buy, usually the more effective drugs that would address whatever the doctor thought they were dealing with were more expensive, but the ibuprofen or the Tylenol, that made them feel better right away. So that was the drug that they bought. And so they had a fever, they took Tylenol, they felt better. But you know what? They didn't buy the other drugs. And in some ways, this is, at least if Christianity is true and if religions have validity, religions, in a sense, are looking at not just the individual, but are looking at the community and are looking at all kinds of other dimensions, which by its very nature, and the power of therapy and the power of science is to remove variables and say, this is our goal. So,
right. That's one thing I do appreciate about Peterson is his all, like, quote unquote, all levels of analysis thinking.
Yep.
And like you were saying, in a therapeutic relationship, the secular therapist isn't exactly putting too much emphasis on the institution of marriage, and so he may very well consider telling them that they should divorce or pursue someone else, or when you sign at least in the US, I'm not sure how it works elsewhere, but a marriage is a contract, and you swear to, I don't know if you swear, but or the terminology, but
oh, well,
you agree to.
You bump into this issue when you get to oath taking too,
right?
Because if you say it's a contract, it's a legal contract. That's one thing, but a Christian, why do people want to have weddings in church?
Right.
Why do they? What is the difference between an oath and a contract? Well, an oath you make before God, and there's an implicit narrative in there that says God is going to hold you to it. And so if you break your oath, bad things might happen. So here's another area where it's the frontier between the secular and the sacred. So I don't know, James. Did you want to come back in on this at all, or do you think we've hashed it out sufficiently?
Exhausted it.
I mean, we could talk on this for hours, but we should probably get to something else.
All right. Okay.
For later, I have a question, unless you want to take it now. It's way out of context, or like not about this at all, but it doesn't have to be right now.
Let's do 1 or 2 from the text chat, and then hop back in closer to the end.
Yeah.
I think that
sounds good. Thank you for your participation. That was great.
Thank you.
All right. So this kind of it's the way the narrative stream of these questions and answer goes. So H. Woozle. Howdy, Paul. Can you divulge any information on how you met and wooed Mrs. PVK? If you were in a single person's shoes, how would you go about spouse hunting during the pandemic apocalypse with the additional hindrance of getting to know someone from 6 feet away in a city under lockdown? What would be romantic to a Calvinist? There are a lot of implicit questions in there. Okay. I actually thought about this question a lot last night. I went to bed and I started thinking about, because I'd read through some of the questions, and gosh, how am I going to talk about this? Because I can talk about me, and I got to be a little careful talking about my wife, because that's a high stakes relationship. So I met my wife at Calvin College. I was in my 4th year as a senior, but I was going to have to take a 5th year because I did engineering and math before I did history, and then pre-sem, and I needed 2 years of Greek to get into Calvin Seminary at that point. So I was a 4th year, and I remember the moment I saw my wife for the first time. My wife was a very beautiful woman, and I remember seeing her, and it was just like, I saw her and I remembered her. And that was her first year. She was a freshman. I met her later that year. I was a campus cop. I was a security guard. And my main wooing technique was part of my job was walking around a campus 4 hours a night. Or 3 nights a week, 4 nights a week or so. Sometimes walk through buildings, sometimes walk through parking lots. And I would just invite girls to, walk with me on my tour, because I'm just walking through empty buildings and empty parking lots, and it was actually a great way to get to know women. And so I just always did that. And then one night I was doing rounds, and she was in her dorm, and she was studying late with another guy, and I stopped in and I did then what I do now. I talked, and I remembered her right away. And then the next year, my 5th year, she actually moved into the same apartment building I was living on campus. And I kind of stuck that in the back of my head. And then we had a little social mixer in the apartment. And I came up to her and I asked her if she remembered me, which she did not. And then she, noticing that I remembered her, thought that was a little stalky and a little creepy. But I did remember, but I've got a pretty good memory for certain things. And nothing really happened after that, but I picked up, a few things, like she was a Spanish major and a religion major, and she was interested in being a missionary. And so that interim in January, I was going to Latin America because we were touring the Sandinista Revolution, and she was a Spanish major, and so I bumped into her. And I told her I was doing that. She thought that was interesting. I had a little snippet of a conversation. And I said, basically, hey, when I get back, do you want to hear about it? She said, sure. So I got back and I looked her up again. And one thing led to another. And that was, that would have been spring of 86 when I got back from that trip. And then we started dating in spring of 86. And we eventually married in the summer of 88. I'm not a terribly romantic person, and I think if I were better at romance, that would have been a good thing. But Dutch Calvinists aren't generally very good at romance. Historically, they discouraged dancing unless it was square dancing or the klompen. And if you want to see the klompen dance, you can go to YouTube and search Holland, Michigan Tulip Festival, and all the little Dutch CRC kids go out into the street and dance the klompen. But I didn't grow up there, so I didn't even learn that dance. So not a very romantic person. But what I did think about with respect to this question and your question is some of the advantages that we had, which were, and this actually gets into a lot of these questions about morality, in that we lived at a time and a place where there were moral expectations about courtship and dating and marriage. And the expectation was that you hold off on various levels of sexuality until marriage, and that you commit to lifelong monogamy. And we were living in a context where there was a lot of religious pressure and support for pursuing those goals. I remember having a conversation in my dorm with a bunch of friends. We're all just sort of comparing notes in terms of sexual history. It sounds so 1950s American, but just kind of going around the room finding out who all had crossed that line and who all hadn't, and then even with who in some cases. So it's just kind of late night dorm talk. But I was on the innocent side of that line, and I hadn't necessarily formally dated a lot of girls. I'd gone on a lot of walks, and my route was basically, if I saw someone I was interested in them, I would sort of find a way to become their friend. I would usually put them in the friend zone first and keep them there for a while because I wanted to get a good look before I would make a move. And usually I would get to know them and find something either I liked or didn't like and sort of deal with that. But with the woman who became my wife, she she was a keeper, and I decided to continue to pursue that. But what I'm getting at, and I think what your question is getting at here, is really the context. And I think you're right in terms of the pandemic. There are some additional obstacles, but sort of analogous to my dating strategy. You've got things like social media, and I think that's both a complexity and an opportunity. At Calvin College, there were, maybe a student body of almost 4,000 students, so about half of which would be women. Most of those women would have a high degree of commonality in terms of values and orientation and culture. It's in a lot of ways, it's really a prime way to find a spouse. And the additional morality, incentive, enforcement structure or reinforcement structure of holding off on sexual intimacy until marriage. A lot of this is poo-pooed and not respected today, but especially given what then were continued encouragement to pursue lifelong monogamy and a commitment for life, this sets people up for, I think, a pretty good path to this area of life. Again, I was talking with Rick about this woman and her husband who are suddenly successful pornographers, and how that will go long term. Part of the way this works is that when you're young and beautiful, and especially if there's a degree of resistance in terms of if there's a culture which delays sexual gratification to a degree, that really does lead people into making a commitment motivated by your sexual desire in some ways. Now, does this always work? Oh, absolutely not. Are there tons of pitfalls? Absolutely. And I could talk about those kinds of things a long time, but it makes a lot of sense to fall in infatuation and lust when you're young, when you've got all these assets of youth, and then to begin a process of entering into far deeper levels of love and commitment and bondedness. My wife and I have almost 33 years of marriage together. We have 5 children together. We have, for us to get a divorce now, not saying it can't happen or it's impossible, but it would come at a horrendous cost. It would come at a horrendous cost financially. It would come at a horrendous cost in terms of my children's well-being. It would come at a horrendous cost on lots of different levels. And all of that got prompted because one day outside of Rooks Vendel dorm, I saw a woman that really caught my eye, and I decided I'd like to get to know her. And found out we had some mutual interests about missionary work and some of these things. And one thing led to another, and it put us on a path. Now, the path isn't necessarily always easy, but when I think at comparing our situation to like these profitable pornographers that want to have their children in Catholic school, I think even secular therapists could look at that situation and say, although it might be financially lucrative right now, in terms of the long-term strategy for your marriage, it's probably not a good bet. There was a movie that came out a number of years ago with Demi Moore and Robert Redford and Woody Harrelson, where basically Redford was an older, high-status, wealthy man that met Demi Moore and her husband Woody Harrelson at a party, and basically said to Woody Harrelson, "I'll give you two $1 million. I'll give you $1 million if you let me sleep with your wife." And that, of course, leads into, conversation between the guy and his wife and all of this, and should we do it? And then, not too many spoilers, the movie's been out a little while. She does go to bed with Robert Redford, and of course that leads to all kinds of complexities. Is it worth $1 million? Now, $1 million in the 80s is more, 80s or 90s, I don't remember, the movie came out, is worth more than it is now. So I don't necessarily have a lot of advice in terms of, should you use dating apps, how to use social media, but potentially the pandemic, if you want to sort of observe pandemic protocols, you might have a lot of Skype conversations and phone conversations where you get to know the woman beyond her body before you start to enjoy what now has become the sexual protocol of our society. And that could actually help you try and find a partner that's not only looks good to you physically and sexually, but some of the longer term values of, do you two have a compatible set of value systems? Do you have a compatible set of religious ideas? How compatible is your personality? So the pandemic offers both limitations, but it's often the case that limitations also offer unforeseen possibilities. And just like the religious and moral framework within which my wife and I, basically fell in love, got married, made commitments to each other, had children, the pandemic offers some limitations that could potentially offer some opportunities and again, back to this question that James really got us going with, that offers additional benefits that might not be apparent when you're in your 20s and you're good looking and young, they're good looking and young. Your biological level is saying, make babies. And the cultural level is saying, we know how to act like we're making babies, but we aren't going to make any babies. And it's a lot of fun. But long-term well-being in terms of the entire span of your life, and not only your life, but the life of your potential children, the life of your potential grandchildren, the life of the entire community around you. Again, this is the scale at which religions work. My little internal gyroscope of meaning and well-being, well, I'll tell you, when you're young and you see a very attractive person, meaning is hitting 10 on the scale, well-being is hitting 10 on the scale, but what those two scales are directing you to might not be the best thing on your scale for you 20 years from now. So I don't know if that's a good answer or not. I'd be curious to hear from the voice chat room.
Well, since Paul and I both scored wives well above our level, some of it has to do with being very bold and being willing to risk it and being willing to commit to something that you don't know about. And that's terrifying to people these days.
Yep.
They want to know everything about something before they'll commit to it, whether it be, reading reviews on Yelp to go to a restaurant back when we used to, or anything related to purchasing. They absolutely make no decisions without this thorough research. And, it favors a bold person.
Yep. And I was not a bold dater. I was a sneaky dater because I just I just was, I wasn't the best looking guy. I wasn't a jock. I didn't have all those assets, but hey, you use what you got.
Speaking of being sneaky in the dating life, how explicit should Jesus smuggling be in courtship?
I think the unequally yoked is real wisdom, because you're going to at least, again, to want to start with a set of values that are at least compatible. Now, in terms of a long-term marriage, it's quite likely both you and your spouse's values are going to continue to evolve and change. And then the challenge of the marriage is to, how do we continue to not only make this marriage work, but have it be enjoyable, because having it be enjoyable is part of making it work, even as our values are changing, which gets into later questions about The Bachelor, which I think we'll have to get into here. But yeah, but I think, again, for me growing up at Calvin College, and actually Calvin College for the Christian Reformed Church in our subculture was known as a dating ground. And when you were students, you sort of sneered at that. But by the time I got my fourth year, I was thinking about it, saying, there's probably never going to be, we didn't have the internet or social media or anything like that. I said to myself, there's probably never going to be, I'm probably never going to have as good an opportunity to find a menu of women who are compatible in terms of my moral system, my value system, have a similar language, on and on and on and on. I'm never going to have the options that I'm finding right now. And so by my fourth year, it's like, I got to get busy. And the truth is, when I started Calvin Seminary, almost all of the students were already married. And I wasn't, me and a few other guys weren't. And it was like, I really got to get busy with this.
Can I ask a question on that, actually?
Sure.
So where I live and where I grew up, it's a pretty secular area, and so the only religious people that you would meet would be in the church.
Yep.
Basically. And I grew up in a Baptist church, and so your options were Baptist people or Mormon people. And one of the things that makes me a little bit concerned about my church culture is that I feel like this almost feels a little blasphemous to say, but it feels like they almost take the biblical wisdom a step too far when it comes to marrying young, because as far as the people in my church community, basically all of them have gotten married by the age of 18, or they have become secular in some way. So I was wondering what your opinion on that would be, because it's a 0 to 100 situation. Yeah.
That's a really excellent question. A few years ago, I was watching so there's a whole Christian industrial evangelical media culture, and there was a debate on the pros and cons of marrying young. And I think that's a real debate, because and James sort of got into this. This is a subject that this is a subject I've wanted to really bring onto my channel for a long time, in talking with Joey and talking with James, because I think our current culture is doing young unmarried people a real disservice, because I think it is extraordinarily difficult to achieve one of the most important things we need to achieve today at your age. It's certainly gotten more complex. In that debate, one of the things that people advise is marry young, because actually if you marry young, you can get a jump on your wife having children in her 20s instead of her 30s, which there's a lot of good reasons for that. You're a less wise parent, but you're a more energetic parent, when you're having children in your 20s rather than your 40s, especially for a man, 40s or even 50s. So there are a lot of good points on the marry young side. And then the two of you are going to have to sort of work through all of these issues together that are facing Christians today. And maybe it'll break up your marriage, or maybe it won't, because that's part of what's happening. The other side is face those issues as a single person, and then you're going to have to deal with all of the questions of single sexuality in our culture, which has to do with, am I going to be sexually active or not? How am I going to date? Is sex going to be part of my dating life? How am I going to stand with respect to the traditional teachings of the church and sexuality? All of these issues then you're going to deal with as a single person, and well, you're probably going to have a lot of trial and error. And by the time, if you decide to now sort of getting over the hump, usually in your 30s, getting over the hump and saying, okay, I've lived the single lifestyle. I've tried the secular path. I've done all of this stuff. I am deciding to try the Christian way. I am going to find a spouse. I am going to try to pursue a Christian way of dating and of marriage and of pair bonding and of bringing children into the world, and I am going to pursue this. It's hard because now, well, you've got a sexual history. Those people who married young, they might very well have been virgins. And whereas, it psychologically, and the psychological thing, it's an interesting conversation. If you're better going into marriage with a lot of sexual history or with no sexual history, because if you go in with no sexual history, yeah, you're gonna learn together and you're gonna work some things out, and you're gonna have to deal with a lot of those tough issues, but you're doing it from within marriage. And you might say, well, it's better to have people who've had a sexual history before, but I've never really met a couple that the one spouse says of the other, gosh, I wish my husband had slept with about 30 girls before I met him, and has those 30 women out there that he could potentially be Facebook friends with, or maybe work in his office. These things aren't insurmountable, but they sure are complexities. And so I think, the question you ask is a really good one and a really hard one. And is it better to marry when you're young and to sort of work the Christian marriage thing from the inside, having to face all of the assaults that are going to come from our current cultural moment? Or do you figure out and weather those assaults as a single person and then try for Christian marriage? It's a hard question. And, I've been happy about the fact that a couple of people have found romance and love here on the Bridges of Meaning Discord server and are pursuing marriage. I think that's a cool thing. And so find people you are compatible with. And you're exactly right. Churches can be really weird places to look for love. And the church often is not necessarily a very helpful partner in terms of that process. But it's hard. It's just hard. But you're right to identify this path of, do you marry young and sort of figure it out from inside a Christian marriage? Or do you weather it as a single person and then sort of get over a bunch of humps and then pursue a Christian marriage? It's tough. And again, I don't know if there's any other wisdom from the voice chat here on this.
Hearing this as a Brit, it's just almost incomprehensible that in America, what you consider marrying young would here be pretty much considered to be children. That even marrying in your mid-20s is considered really young here. And so all this talk of people getting married in their teens, it's so incredibly foreign. And yet there's so many things in which America and Britain are near identical that it's so weird to see this massive cultural difference here.
Wow, that's amazing.
Yeah, that's really interesting to hear. I just I was part of a friend's wedding, and she thought she was getting married a little bit older, and she's not even 25 yet. So that's that's really interesting to hear.
Like when I say I'd like to be married by the time I'm 25, that's considered ridiculously young in this country.
And I understand that. You know, I really do understand. James, you're still here. Can you talk, James? Because again, James has a lot to say about these things.
So, the average age of first marriage has gone up dramatically in the last about 20 to 30 years. If you look at a line chart of it, you'll just see this absolute rise. I don't have the research in front of me right now, but the average age of women who are getting married these days in the U.S., their first marriage is at 28, and for guys, it's at about 30. What's interesting is that while marriage has gone up, the difference between men and women's age at which they get married is exactly the same. So there's something developmental about us that we want to get married to somebody who's developmentally kind of our same place. But yeah, I think the early marriage has some real, I have real issues with early marriage because our culture has shifted towards education being the massive thing you're pursuing at that age. But biology hasn't shifted with our cultural shift. So there's a conundrum there.
Yeah.
Yeah. If I could say one more thing on this, I've basically taken the path of denying that path for myself at the time being because I want to work out a few things, especially regarding where I am regarding my religious positions, and I have a question further down that kind of highlights some of those issues, but it's oh shoot, I totally forgot what I was gonna say. I just had a brain fart, but oh yeah, I wouldn't be so uncomfortable with marrying young if there was more generational wisdom speaking into this.
Yeah.
But it's so individualistic that it's basically a blank slate with each person that I've seen marry young, and I see a lot of the same problems repeating themselves. And so it's interesting to have a culture in the church of marry young, but also not a lot of people speaking into that from their generational wisdom and from their learned experiences. So, for that reason, I've held off on really pursuing that just to develop myself personally.
That's a great comment. If there's one learning that I continue to grow and appreciate, it is that we as individuals are far more connected to each other on so many different levels than we know. And when you get to this question of marriage, marriage does rely on a context to be successful. Healthy cultures afford for the people who will live in them and submit to them wisdom that the individuals have not had time to access or develop themselves. And so your point is extremely important because, at least here in America, if you are part of a church and a community that has wisdom to support young marriage, as James said, biologically, that's, having babies in your 30s, there's a lot of reasons biologically to not do it. Economically, you're much better off waiting, get that house, get your careers well underway, but biologically, and then you're sort of setting yourself up for small families. My wife and I have 5 children. 5 children cost a lot of money in today's world. Putting 5 kids through college, the kind of price tag that costs, and so especially that they don't have a lot of college debt. On the other hand, when I look at the relationships between my children that they have with each other, they have, it's the best times of the year for me and my wife are when all 5 of our kids are together It is so much fun. They're now all in their 20s. Well, my oldest just turned 30. But it is so much fun to watch them develop and grow. And all of my children, I sound, all of my children are just brilliant, amazing, astounding, wonderful human beings. Every single one of them. And I've been very fortunate with respect to that. And those of you who know, my son Jared is around this community a little bit. He's at the local meetup a lot. And my youngest son Ben pops into the Discord every now and then. But my children, I love my children. And when they are together, I love watching them together. We couldn't have done that. I was 25 when we got married, and my wife was just about 22. And then it was 3 years into our marriage that we had our first. And then another 3 years, the second came along. And then every 2 years after that, we had up to 5. And talk about meaningful. Talk about worthwhile for a life. None of my children are married. Some of them have some significant relationships now. But what I want for them, I want them to be able to make a commitment and have a marriage and have some children. I want the grandchildren. I want them bad. I love babies. I love kids. But I want them to enjoy the joy that I have in my children. And culturally, we're not doing a lot to set people up for that. There's so many cross pressures. So again, this is a topic I have really wanted to bring into the channel a lot more, but haven't been able to, partly because I often think that I want to have these conversations with James, and you get a sense of what James can offer, and Joey, because Joey's very articulate with this. And we're bringing in different perspectives because, of course, I'm a Christian minister. James is a Christian. Joey is an atheist. And I've sort of been waiting for the right female conversation partner to bring into these conversations. But I actually approached some high status women who are more from the left out there in the world who could bring in some diversity into the conversations. And once they hear I'm associated with Jordan Peterson, they don't want to talk to me. So maybe we'll have to get Sherry in on some of this because Sherry's got a lot of wisdom. But yeah, these are huge issues.
Paul, can I make one comment about the COVID thing?
Yes.
So just for me personally, I've dated more during COVID than I ever did in my whole life. And I found that people are actually more serious than what I've seen before. I think the pandemic has sort of given people time to think about what they want and get serious about what they want. And so I actually don't think that the whole pandemic thing is as hopeless as it may seem. That's my 2 cents.
Good. Thank you. I suspect I watch my kids too. I'm not going to talk about them here because at least I'll talk about Jared a little bit because he's in the room, but I won't talk about my daughters because they're not in the room, or my sons that aren't in the room. But I suspect that's right. I'm not surprised by that. So thank you, Cassidy. I'm really glad that you chimed in on that. Because I know there's a fair number of single people here on the server too, and some married. So this is an important topic because I am, as a pastor, I am really concerned for you all in your 20s and 30s, because now that I'm in my 50s, I have a greater appreciation that the clock is ticking. There are some windows here. Some of those windows are biological. Some of those windows are developmental. Some of those windows are, if you're going to be able to experience having children. And so I had a conversation with Ivan that will come out on my channel probably next week. And Ivan's father was, quite old. And Ivan had mentioned that, how old Ivan was when his father died. And I thought, oh, his father must have died young. And Ivan said, no, my father was in his 90s. I said, oh, then your father had you late. He said, yeah. His father never got a chance to see Ivan marry. Ivan is expecting a child. Ivan and his wife are expecting a child. His father never got a chance to see Ivan's children. I want to see my grandchildren. I want to see them grow up. My grandparents saw me grow up. My parents, to one degree or another, saw my children grow up. These are joys in our world that, especially at the cultural level that I look at in terms of the media that is getting put on 20 and 30 somethings, there's very little incentive or appreciation of those values that are there. But if we didn't have this lying media culture around us, if we were growing up without these screens, you would probably be spending more time and more locality. I mean, there's lots of layers to this. You would be seeing grandparents and great-grandparents enjoying this experience of children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. These are some of the deepest joys and most profound, meaningful things you can have in life. And our culture doesn't value them a bit. And I think our culture is setting up a lot of you in your 20s and 30s for missing out. Now, that being said, managing a marriage today, a long-term marriage, it has certainly not gotten easier. And there are fewer supports for it than there used to be. And even though I appreciate the fact that 30 years ago, I remember when I had a cousin who, probably the first one in our extended family to get divorced. And she's really in that extended family, thinking about it, the only one who did get divorced, which is a pretty astounding thing in our day. But divorce culture has paid you, and many of you know this far better than I because your parents got divorced. Divorce culture there's been a heavy price for that. But there was a heavy price, for staying together. And there's so many no-wins in this world. There always are. There always have been. But I get so annoyed at our present culture that just is so dishonest about the trade-offs and exchanges. And again, this is one of the things I really appreciate about Jordan Peterson, because he, better than most, could talk about it in a really credible way. So what I want for all of you folks in your 20s and 30s, I do want you to find a spouse and make babies and enjoy what that has to offer. I do. That's what I want for you. So anyway, maybe enough on that. There's an hour and 8 minutes. We didn't get past the first question. Well, we had 2 questions in all fairness, and some and some other questions. So, all right. Nose to the grindstone. Jason, Almond Tree. I just thought of another question. I was listening to a podcast of yours a while back. I don't remember which one, but you were talking about the ascension and how we tend to view it through a materialistic perspective. Right. C.S. Lewis does that in his book Miracles. I've been thinking about the resurrection, and I've always taken it to be a physical resurrection. Yes. That's exactly what the Apostle Paul intends to communicate. I feel like it needs to be material in order for the hope for the new earth. Yes, I agree. What are your thoughts on this? I agree. I'm not sure how to view the ascension or the resurrection. These 2 verses have been giving me trouble. Read C.S. Lewis's book Miracles. He talks quite a bit about the resurrection, and he talks about the ascension. And it was actually, I think, the ascension, in terms of dealing with what Lewis was trying to deal with, what Mathieu Pajot is dealing with in his book, this question of the sort of the divorced worldview of the ancient and medieval versus the modern worldview. The ascension is something that is an episode in the Bible that really sort of, you can see the seam between those worldviews, because once, we're on this ball and we can get up above the atmosphere, and we just sent a rover to Mars, how are we supposed to think about all this? So then what does the ascension mean? Because Well, if Jesus is God, surely he knows we're in a globe circling around another globe. Why ascend? Well, the ascension communicated to the disciples exactly its accommodation. This is a very old theological concept that if God is going to communicate, he's going to have to accommodate to not only our language, but to our symbolic world, because we are baked into understanding things in symbolic and archetypal ways. So, yeah, physical resurrection. Richard, I hate to ask a Bible question, since you've wanted to get more variety in the estuary, but perhaps it can branch out to a larger question. Me? My questions branch out? Never. Eric Weinstein talked about the necessity of better conversations in his most recent podcast with Friedman, and among the topics he listed was free will. I came to the conclusion a couple months ago that I could do nothing but accept the typical new atheist script when it comes to free will. But my reaction was a bit like Roger Penrose to William Lane Craig's proposal about God on Unbelievable. Roger basically said, what am I supposed to do with this? In other words, the new atheist view is in some ways a counterproductive intellectual exercise. That's right, it is. I think a better way to get into the conversation is to examine Jacob's wrestling with God. I've been fascinated by this story for a while now, and I'm actually slated to preach on it 2 months from now. One reason I think it's valuable is because it is the culmination of the two-tier heaven and earth dynamic throughout the Jacob story. Yes, that is a culmination story. That's a pivotal story in the Jacob cycle. How would it not be? That's a great observation. When heaven and earth meet in this encounter, you talked about our modern inability to conceptualize the simultaneous agency of us and God, or, in a purely psychological sense, whatever I am and the forces which move me. How can Jacob's wrestling help us better understand this, and what can it help to have better free will conversation? So, when I mention I'm a Calvinist, the relevance realization always goes to issues like double predestination and all of these agency questions, even though, as Anselman again and again points out in the comment section, and he's dead on right, Calvin inherits these issues from, wait for it, Roman Catholic theology. He gets them from Augustine. So I think what really happened in the 17th century is that the psychological, if you think about tectonic plates, so if you look at volcanism and hotspots and things like that in terms of the world, there's like the Earth's crust, and underneath there's these hotspots, and the crust and the hotspots move around. Okay, that's one way to think about theology and philosophy. And so why can't all my books be easy to grab? If you look at Brett Sockold's, did I move that book? Why isn't it right here? I pulled it off to. If you look at Brett Sockold's transubstantiation, the argument he makes in that book is that by the time Martin Luther got to interpreting Aquinas, the philosophical substructure implicit in what they were doing, the language had changed, and so transubstantiation no longer meant to Luther what it meant to Aquinas. And so Luther's consubstantiation, in Sockold's view, was Luther's attempt to try to recapture what Aquinas meant by transubstantiation. But of course, Luther didn't know that. And so then Luther, he's in the midst of a fight for his life with the Roman Catholic Church. So, they go to war, and you have a Protestant Reformation, et cetera, et cetera. John Calvin comes around, and he doesn't like the consubstantiation word, doesn't like the transubstantiation word, because he's got the same philosophical issues that Luther does. So Calvin starts talking about real presence. And Sockold basically is like, transubstantiation, real presence? They're trying to point to the same thing. Oh, I read that book and it was like, oh boy. But some of that happens with Calvin and agency. And this is why Richard Mueller's great essay, Was Calvin a Calvinist, is so vitally important, because Mueller notes the change in the reading of Calvin from the 16th century to the 17th century. And in all fairness to those who get into this, the philosophical underpinnings had changed quite a bit. Why am I bringing Calvin and the Reformation into this question about Jacob and wrestling? One of the best treatments of this question of Jacob wrestling with God comes from John Calvin in his commentary on Genesis. Read it. And I brought this up in my videos before, because Calvin says Jacob could not wrestle with God unless God was supporting him. So Calvin, in this moment of eloquence, says, and I'm dyslexic, so I'll get the right and the left mixed up, possibly 50% chance. God fights with Jacob with his left hand while supporting him with his right hand. What is Calvin saying in that? You see there in that text that Calvin is in touch with the conversation surrounding agency that the church, the medieval church, the church historically had wrestled with. That Calvin actually has a very nuanced sense of agency. You see it right there in that passage. Now, 100 years later, suddenly everybody's, and I hear it when people, oh, you're a Calvinist, and then they trot out all of this stuff that came up later. Oh, so you're a Calvinist, and so agency. And quite rightly, you see, Sam Harris in so many ways echoes 19th century dispensationalists. And, I don't have anywhere near as much time to make as many videos as I want to. It's probably for your benefit. But if you read Richard Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture, and you read segments there about Scottish common sense realism and how that gets applied to American and English theologians that are wrestling with modernism and how it's impacting Christianity and the entire development of dispensationalism, it all makes sense with respect to all of these agency questions. And this is a big part of how we've gotten into this mess about, well, if, all these naughty agency questions about God. And that's where, Sokold really was helpful, and Bishop Barron is helpful, and these older traditions that get into the question of, well, it's God number one. It's the Arenic aspect of God that's working. And Calvin articulates that in an amazing way in his commentary of Genesis about this moment of Jacob wrestling with God. And Joseph articulates that at the end of the book of Genesis. It's all there in the Bible. Now, that being said, in my last videos, I've talked about these splits that happen, these Barfieldian splits that Barfield notices and talks about, how spirit and wind are the same word, and now suddenly they're not. And Lewis, again, in his book on miracles, notices this change and basically says, you can't just go back and your final participation is different. Lewis doesn't use these words, but he's talking to Barfield and he gets it from Barfield. Final participation isn't exactly the same as initial participation. You've gone through your loss of participation. In other words, there needs to be somehow a new, I don't want to bring in too much Hegel here, a new synthesis as such that finally realizes without losing all of the things that you've learned in the middle. And that's where we're at right now with respect to agency. And that's why we've, my friend Bob on Twitter just keeps hammering me about Non-duality, non-duality. Yeah. But you haven't shown me the math, buddy. And you don't just deny these splits. When I say the wind blew, you don't understand it as spirit in the way that an ancient does. And you can't go back. And it's not dissimilar to, the question of once you've experienced something as an adult, you can no longer see it with the eyes of a child, but you must learn to have childlike faith. And how do you do that? So I'd say read John Calvin's, you can find it online. It's free. It's in public domain. ccel.org. Calvin College hosts that. Find John Calvin on Jacob wrestling with God. And think about that in terms of so many of the other issues that I've been talking about in my channel. And that should put you on a path to learn something.
What was the book title exactly? Jacob Wrestling with God?
The book title it's John Calvin's commentary on the book of Genesis. And it's one of John Calvin's best. Now, John Calvin it's not easy to read John Calvin necessarily. My friend Randy Blackadder is doing a fresh new translation of Calvin's Institutes, and I'm really excited about that because Calvin's Institutes needs a new translation. Calvin is an interesting guy because he is a preacher scholar, as many of the reformers were. And so his commentaries aren't like most of these commentaries behind me, which are technical. It's a pastoral commentary. And he tends to, what John Calvin did was he'd write something and he'd keep expanding the sucker, and it just gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. But John Calvin's commentary on the book of Genesis is one of his best commentaries, and it's sort of a classic. So, and the best part of it is his treatment of Jacob wrestling with God. Just that one image of, God. What are you saying? God fought himself? That's not the right language. Do we have the right language? And this is where, and I'm sure most of you have had this experience. You have a conceptualized thought that you can't articulate. And so then you try words, you try to put words, map that thought onto certain words, and you keep trying new language. That's a really astounding thing, and I think it gets at a lot of the two hemisphere brain things. It's the right side of the brain, the abstract side of the brain, through images and things can sort of intuit a relationship, but the left side of the brain hasn't quite figured out how to map it, there's another check on your bingo box, hasn't quite figured out how to capture it and articulate it. And that it's in that way that artists are really powerful communicators in the way that pastors using words struggle to be. So it's a good question. Drew Miniker, will you do a video commentary on John McWhorter's sustained atheist argument against wokeism as religion? I would love to. That's one of there are dozens of videos in my head that I think I really like to do a video on that, because my videos are for me, my monologue videos are for me ways of trying to work things out. I regularly get comments on my videos. You just rambled and talked for 2 hours, and I often notice that. And in one commenter, he didn't like my comment about Jesus and FU money and my Brett Weinstein video this week because, well, that was just clickbait. Well, if you actually get to the end of the video, that clickbait is a title that is deceptive. That title wasn't deceptive. That title was exactly what that video is about. But I had sort of a conceptual understanding of what I wanted to treat. And so in a lot of ways, what those monologue videos are, you're listening to the left side of my brain deal with the right side of my brain, trying to bring conceptual inklings into words. That's why it takes me an hour or two. And so it's like, I don't want to hear you ramble. Then don't watch. And I'm just frankly amazed anybody does want to hear me ramble, because I would ramble whether you listen or not. And I ramble whether or not most of the planet listens or not. But that's exactly what I'm doing then. And quite frankly, with these questions, that it's exactly what I'm doing now. So, onto the topic. John McWhorter, when he says, you know, I love the way John McWhorter's brilliant. And, you know, you should check out his books because he's brilliant. And he's fun to listen to. He's stone cold atheist. And when he says it's religion, it's not a compliment. But he's got a point. But then to actually to take that out of sort of the conceptual things we're seeing and articulate it, I think at some point I'll probably make a video when my left brain sort of says, here's some language to at least try, and then I'll ramble for an hour. But no, McWhorter is right. And he's not saying anything he's not complimenting religion. He's an atheist, but he's right. And I do want to, at some point, dig into that more. That video is competing again with dozens of other videos that are always circling in my head, because all of those things are conceptual questions that I have that are just roaming around in my head. So, someone wanted to say something? I guess not. Okay. Nate Heil. Ooh, I'm a little nervous. Nate's such a smart guy. He writes such good comments on my videos. And he has great conversations with, if you're not, Karen and her meeting code channel. I mean, Karen does an amazing job on that channel, and I don't listen to anywhere near as many videos as I should on that channel. But Karen is brilliant, and she's dogged, and I just love what she's done with her channel. Anyway, that's the meeting code. Thinking of Tom Holland and Leo Tolstoy. Yeah. And others who love the gospel of Jesus but find the gospel about Jesus hard to have faith in. Someone somewhere in a comment, gosh, I don't know how my brain works. Someone somewhere in a comment said, you really got to watch, that British series Civilization, episode 13 on heroic modernism or heroic materialism. I don't remember what the title was. So I watched a bit of that last night. And they had a great section on Tolstoy in that video. And it really made me want to do a dive into Tolstoy. But his books are so darn long. And I've read Tolstoy's Confession. Is it Confession? Is that the title of it? I've read it a couple of times, and I love that book. It is a powerful book. Now, I know some of you who have long theological noses will say, yeah, but there's issues. Of course there's issues. But I loved the heart of Tolstoy as he was wrestling with those issues, when and where he was wrestling with them. So thinking of Tom Holland and Leo Tolstoy, what an interesting pair. And others who love the gospel of Jesus but find the gospel about Jesus hard to have faith in. And what we mean by that, hard to be able to say, I believe in Jesus. I believe. What is my only comfort in life and in death? That I am not my own, but belong in life and in death to my faithful Savior, Jesus Christ, who has fully paid for all my sins with his precious blood and has set me free from the tyranny of the devil. Heidelberg question and answer 1. If you want a little something to remember that's really helpful in your Christian life, memorize Heidelberg Catechism, question and answer 1. It's beautiful. Anyway. Have made an error in not centering the church on the gospel of Jesus. Okay, I better read the whole sentence again. Others who find the gospel about Jesus hard to have faith in have made an error not centering the church on the gospel of Jesus. My answer is yes, but I'm a kooky Christian anarchist who thinks that community building is an essential function of the church. That is kind of a weird anarchist position to hold. My guess is your answer will be estuary, but that might not be thinking big enough. Estuary is a name to what my heart longs for. So this morning, again, Rick and I were talking about the profitable pornographers and their desire to have their kids go to Catholic school. And I posted the question to Rick. I said, Rick, what if she and her husband came to our church? Now, Living Stones is a very easygoing place. It's really hard to get kicked out of Living Stones. You pretty much have to physically assault somebody. Short of that, it's really hard to get kicked out of Living Stones. Doesn't necessarily mean you'll be a member, but there are Sundays here that many of the people here are not formal members. Rick isn't a formal member of the church. But Rick is about as essential around here as anybody, especially right now. I don't know what we'd do without Rick. But he's not a formal member of the church. So, Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland. I don't know that Jordan Peterson and Tom Holland, if they lived in Sacramento, would bother coming to Living Stones Church. That doesn't... My problem with that isn't so much with Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson. It's with the church's inability to engage them productively in a way that would lead them to further depths of discipleship with Jesus. But what does that mean? I had a conversation with a colleague yesterday on the phone. He was watching one of my videos, which I found terribly flattering because I really respect and esteem my colleagues. And we were talking about this because he's got a church plant and he's got one of the coolest church plants in the area. And they're in a university town and they're doing okay. But, you know, he's like, we're not busting out the, you know, we're not having to build a new wing on the church, you know, even before COVID. We're another little struggling group and, you know, they're much more. They've got written liturgy and they've got weekly Eucharist and they're one of these CRC churches that sort of looks longingly towards Roman Catholics, Anglicans, and Orthodoxes. And he was the one that said to me, you know, if the Roman Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church patch it up, I'm heading. I'm leaving. I'm going to them. I won't name him, embarrass him, but you know, I totally understand his point. And I understand he's been saying these kind of things to me for years, and I understand them now better than ever. But we had a conversation yesterday, and we're talking about how on earth do we do church? And for me, just going Orthodox or Roman Catholic doesn't really cut it. I understand the problems that resolves, but I also see whole hosts of problems that it doesn't. And so I'm not jumping ship. I expect to be CRC for as long as the CRC exists, which the way things are looking, I might outlive the CRC. Who knows? So, and I don't mean just Living Stones CRC. At the same time, and I told my colleague this, and he agrees with me on both counts. At the same time, I'm bullish on the church. The church is going to get through this thing. God is, you know, and I did 2 conversations this week. I did a conversation with Ivan, and I did a conversation with Chris Golden. And having conversations like that encourage me, because what do I see? There are 2 young men there who are doing the work. They're fighting the fight. They're working the issues. They're trying to figure it out. And I say, yeah, it's a mess. The church is a mess. There's chaos out there. But I'm betting on the church. I'm betting long. And I'm not leaving. And, you know, I'm going to stick with my dying little group until it's no longer viable and we have to readjust things, and whether that means merging with another church or whatever it takes. I'm not leaving the body of Christ. And the Roman Catholics and Orthodox say, you're not in the body of Christ. but I'm not leaving. And when I look at Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson, even though, well, I suppose Tom Holland was christened perhaps as an Anglican. I don't know if Jordan Peterson was ever baptized or not. But I want a church that helps guys like them, because I want a church that helps guys like men and women like you all here in this estuary. But I also want a church where young profitable pornographers who want to send their kids to Catholic school can make progress on their marriage and progress on moving closer to Christ. And I'm not saying anything against, let's say, the powers that be in their Roman Catholic school thinking about kicking out the family. They're going to make choices with respect to their own frameworks. But I want a church that can take on all comers. And I want a church that can do that with integrity. And I want a church that can do that with an integral identity. That Tom Holland, the likes of Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson and Leo Tolstoy and Nate Heil and any one of you might not be ready to get baptized or to join, but you would walk out of here saying, I may not believe what they believe, but they're dealing with the real issues of this world and the next. That's what I want from the church. And so that's what all my videos, that's what my work with the meetup, that's what my work here on the Bridges of Meaning, that's what all of this is for. I want the church to reach its potential that I see the trajectory mapped out in the Bible. That's the church I want to see. I'm not sufficient to build that church, but theologically I know that's not actually my job. My job is to do whatever part God might have for me in pursuing that church, because the church is his bride, not mine. And it's his creation, not mine. Now to go back up to the previous question, hopefully God will, through his right hand, work through me. And I see myself as part and partners of Cale Zeldin and my colleague and Jonathan Pajot and many of you in saying, this is the church we're longing to see. How we get there, I have no idea. But that's the road I'm on. And I'll probably only be able to do a tiny little piece of it. But that's good enough for me, because I'm a tiny little person, even big me. So, I don't know, Nate, are you in the room? Or someone else wants to say something? Oh, he just muted his mic. Are you in the room, Nate? Maybe you can't talk. Yeah, you're in the room. Maybe you went to the bathroom or fell asleep. All right, I'll keep moving. Thoughtful Ape. Ooh, we're getting to your question. Might not be able to listen to the answer live, but I'll catch it at a different time. Hopefully, if the recording and everything works. Are we still streaming? Looks like it. Good. The Bible study group Discord is reading through the Bible in a year. Cool. Really struggling with how to read the Old Testament as a historical document. Yeah. But not necessarily as a skeptic. Yeah. That's a real issue. That's another one of those things that I'm always dealing with. And the challenge is actually not in the document, it's in that word historical, because that's one of those splits. That's a modern framework. Now, what exactly, C.S. Lewis writes about this a little bit when he writes about the canonical Gospels. What exactly were they doing? And if you read technical people, New Testament scholars on that, that's a very live question. What exactly are they doing? And this is an issue that, again, I would recommend reading George Marsden's Fundamentalism in American Culture. and a dozen other books. But like Tom Holland and Jordan Peterson and Vervaeke, my main issues come from the apologetic work that I absorbed as a child when it comes to the violence, such as the Old Testament. Yeah, there's a whole other subject. Most of the evangelical reform groups that I grew up in were very quick to explain away rather than to explain the violence of the Old Testament by suggesting an essentially progressive view of history. God was more brutal in a more brutal time, spoke to ancient people in an ancient way, etc. Yeah, this makes me uncomfortable, especially since the setting the New Testament takes place in such a violent and oppressive as the Old Testament. Yes and no. I would recommend reading some of what Yuval Harari, I know I give strange footnotes, Yuval Harari says in his book Sapien about empires. And Tom Holland on The Rest is History is going to do an episode on empire, and I'm very much looking forward to that, because that's a very big deal in the conversation. Because when you read about who Israel is and what's going on in that middle area between Egypt and the Fertile Crescent, that's a wilderness area in some ways. And what happens in that area geopolitically is it's usually either dominated by the empires of the north or Egypt to the west, okay? And so when you have Jericho and wrestling with the Ammonites and the Amorites and the Midianites, that's because there's no empire to dominate it. And when we get to the New Testament, well, Rome is ruling the world. So it's a different paradigm. And I don't think these issues have been brought out enough in this conversation. But I think another interesting part of this conversation with respect to the Old Testament violence question is not only are they giving insufficient attention to the question of empire and how that impacts violence on the ground, it's also a very interesting question as to why modern people are bothered by these issues and ancient people weren't. I don't have a real good ready answer for that, but that's an indication that other things are going on. And I also sort of have a Calvinist answer to this, which is sort of related to a simulation paradigm where, I sat down and my wife was working and my daughter was watching a K-drama and I had a couple of hours to kill. And so I sat down, I played some Civ. And you know what? Nations rose and fell on my little computer, and nobody shed a tear. And I went to bed not giving any concern for the civilizations I slaughtered. Now you might say, wow, but those aren't real. True. But some of these relationships are funny. Okay, back to the question. This makes me uncomfortable, especially since the setting of the New Testament takes place in just as violent and oppressive as the Old Testament. Not really. The imperial layer, I think, impacts this. Indeed, Dominion makes it clear just how brutal in the introduction to the book. Yes. Well, in the Reformation, Christians were finding new and creative ways to torture each other. I finished Fatal Discord recently. Quite haunting. True. Furthermore, the way St. Paul talks about the law in Romans does not condemn God for making the law or enforcing it, but for humanity for transgressing it. Quite right. And so when people like John Piper are sort of bald-faced about these things, on one hand, they are dismissed and people are offended and horrified, but other people say, at least he ain't fudging. So I got some respect for John Piper on that score. Luke shudders. There doesn't seem to be anything progressive in that narrative other than Jesus, of course, but I don't view that as progress as much as I do providence. Two sides of the same coin. Again, I watched some of that Civilization series, episode 13 on the modern period, and he goes into Dickens, and he makes the point that something happened in the 19th century where suddenly we saw slavery through new eyes. And and we saw the ravages of industrialization and the world of Dickens through new eyes. And Tolstoy had a piece of that. And we're looking through the benefit of those new eyes. And now in some ways we're sort of looking back and judging God, okay, or at least the portrayal of God. There you're getting into hazardous waters. Calvin basically says, what does the pot have to say to the potter? And that's my civilization answer. I still think that's a legitimate answer. I don't think in this dispensation God, we will necessarily be able to justify within our frameworks anything that we come into. That doesn't really bother me because I watch human quarreling a lot. Some people, nothing can be justified to them at all. Just watch an argument, a regular garden variety argument between two people. Justification is a very tricky business. So I think this is a very legitimate conversation. I think this is something well worth study, well worth writing books over, well worth lots of discourse to work through the issues and find all of the issues beneath it. All of that is good. But without looking at the experience of judgment and justification in terms of how that plays out between human beings, just go to any office and a boss makes a decision and some of the people under the boss say, I don't think your decision was justified. Maybe he's right, maybe he's wrong. Now take God out of that mix. What are you left with? Just the questions floating around. And for that reason, part of my definition of God is he who can justify what he does. Now, whether that proof is seen, I mean, take a 6-year-old into a college level math class and go ahead and write a proof for something on the blackboard. Can the 6-year-old see it? Maybe have it be a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old who's got a little bit more smarts, and a 12-year-old say, I don't see how you can justify that. College professor would look at a 12-year-old and say, I can understand that. You're 12. So these are important questions, and I understand why they bother people, and they bother me sometimes too. But part of the reason these kinds of questions arose and play out as they do today, and I'm not saying they didn't have forms of it in the ancient world. Look at the book of Job. But part of the formula of this is we have to see ourselves as well. And I know it just sounds like a cheap trick saying, we're the ones doing the judging here. Yeah, but we are the ones doing the judging here. So we can't escape what we are. And that there are questions too hard for us. So I basically go into this and say, you know what, Lord, I got questions, but you know what? I'm going to decide to trust anyway because I look at the alternative. Okay, so God is a tyrant and unfair and unjust, so I won't believe in him. Okay. What you got now? You little carbon being that might live 100 years with your little fist in the air. I'm against you. Oh, okay. Have you ever drowned a rat? We had them in the house in the DR and had a live trap. I'd drown a rat, and I'd take that trap, I'd rate that rat and put it in there. Boy, I sound like a Calvinist like John Piper, don't I? How heartless. But you know what? I had little kids in that house, and that rat didn't belong. And just taking that rat outside the front door and say, "Fly, be free," he'd be back in the house that same day because I got food. And I look at that rat and say, "You know what, rat? It's me, it's my kids, or you." And that little rat would be like, "Don't drown me." Nope. I'm drowning you. Sounds heartless, but we are who we are. So I don't know. That's the way I see it. What exactly am I supposed to make of what the Old Testament is? There's a harder question. And it's a good question. And with a lot of these questions, and life is so full of this kind of thing too, you might get an answer that satisfies yourself at least 70 or 80%, and that would be good. But the pursuit of the question, you will grow in wisdom, you will grow in knowledge, you will grow in all kinds of things that can make you a powerful, formidable human being. And that would be good. So pursue those questions. And by all means, I mean, just because I give the little rat story doesn't mean I want you to, hey, you know, the rat's got a rat level justification for living. So I shouldn't be quite so flippant about drowning that little critter. A rat is an amazing animal. Rats are highly intelligent. Rats in the right time and space and domestication can make wonderful pets and do incredible things. Rats are amazing. And I drown it like it's worth nothing. But in the scope of my house in the Dominican Republic, it did not belong in my house. And I remember I was driving some pastors who were going to visit a church, and driving along the coast, and some dog ran out into the street, and I hit it with my Jeep. And I was going to stop and find out, oh gosh, you know, I hit somebody's dog. I want to make it better. So the pastors looked at me like I had three heads. Because one thing, a dog in America is a cherished pet. A dog in the Dominican Republic, usually not a cherished pet. The pastors looked at me like, it's a dog. You're going to stop? Find out who owns the dog? And your white gringo Jeep driving self are going to go into this little nowheresville in the Dominican Republic and say, "Oh, I hit your dog." And everybody in the town is going to be like, "We're in for a payday." Suddenly the dog is going to be the most valued creature in the town, and they're going to take me to court in the Dominican Republic and demand some king's ransom for this lousy dog that everybody's been kicking. And the pastors all knew this, and I didn't. So I'm like, "Oh, I hit a dog." And the pastor's like, "You're not going to stop and go into that village and try and find an owner. And we don't have time for this. You silly American. Keep driving." So by all means, explore the question. But if I were to sit down and say, "Little rat, I'm about to drown you. I'm about to end your little life. And that little nest of young that you made under the floorboard of my sink, I'm going to kill all your young too. And they will never grow up within a year and have babies of their own and fill this house and eat all my food. I'm stopping all of that today. And I'm sorry, little rat, and maybe I'd be a better person if I'd have this conversation with the little rat. But I didn't. I drowned him. And I don't really feel bad about it.
Can I jump in here? Because
Sure.
I have a couple things to say about all that you just said. There's a lot there.
Yeah, there is.
And it was a big question. But first of all, I'm not quite there to Calvinism yet. I read the Institutes, like I read them, and I'm not.
Congratulations! That's not a small thing.
Yeah. There. It's such, all of this stuff is like, it's a rabbit hole, and each question could consume your entire life, basically.
Yes.
But what I see in the Institutes, Calvin talks a lot about, like, here's a passage here that I just opened up to, and he's talking about the soul and the body, and he says this: the man consists of a soul and a body ought to be beyond controversy. Now I understand by the term soul an immortal yet created essence, which is his nobler part. And when I think of the law, I implicitly, I guess, have a John Locke view of what law is supposed to be. It's this eternal thing that exists somewhere up in the sky, that has been the same for all time, and it's kind of a static thing. And if I were to analogize it, it'd be like the law that I see set up in the Old Testament is like a genetic code. You talk about like the genetic and the epigenetic layer, and then when Jesus comes along, it's like, we thought it was the genetic code for corn or something, but it's actually something way bigger and way more complex. And so that I can definitely see how and oh man, I have so much I want to say, but when you're talking about the rat, you're definitely describing hierarchy.
Yes.
And God sits at the top of that hierarchy, and he is the knower of all things, right? And he exists outside of time, and he has the full picture he has the actual monarchical view of the universe. And so I'm open to the fact that I will not have that view, unless it is somehow revealed to me in some part, probably not in whole, I have to guess.
Definitely not in whole.
Yeah.
You couldn't hold it. It's too big.
Yeah, so I'm comfortable with that. But I guess a big part of this is the view is sola scriptura, because I don't know how to read the Old Testament in the light of that it's a human written document, and that the law that they're written down, there could very well be a difference between what God said and what the people wrote down. And so that's a whole nother rabbit hole that you don't have to answer. But
it's a big rabbit hole.
Yeah, if there's like a book or something that I could read, is there something that touches on that subject?
There's so much that touches on that subject. It's, well, you're asking such good and important questions. And when you think about, you could read Lewis's Abolition of Man, because when you're talking about the law, well, does that mean the laws?
All my friends just rolled their eyes because I've read that book probably 10 times.
Okay. So, yeah. That's probably why you're already asking. That's already why you're attuned to the level of you're seeing the problems now, because you have already made progress down this path, and you're asking the right questions, and you're wrestling with the correct things. And what you're going to wind up seeing is that, well, what happened, all these forks that I talked about that Lewis has in Miracles, what happened, what's going on with these forks? Why am I having a problem with this? And so, so let's just assume a high level of historicity, and, even how to conceptualize, God told Joshua to do exactly what he did to Jericho, and God gave the prohibition on, taking any of the women and children as slaves, and keeping any of the clothing or precious metals for themselves, but to put the city under the ban and destroy it, and then not to rebuild it. So there's a great story where so many of these issues actually come into play, and it's not a story that people generally point to when they look at this issue. But I think that actually is an enormously helpful story to understand the issues involved, because Jericho, sort of like New Orleans, by its location geopolitically, there is going to have to be a city there where Jericho is, just by virtue of the trade routes and everything going on with respect to the geography of the land, just like there's going to be a city where New Orleans is. But those cities are always going to be places of conflict, because of the same geopolitical forces that make them a necessity. And then God puts that city under the ban. What does that mean? And it's almost like these issues are sort of wormholes, because on one hand, you can look at these issues from afar and say, I'm offended at the presence of that wormhole, the implication of what that means about me. Okay. And then go into that wormhole, and you're going to pop out in another, I'm thinking about Star Trek and Deep Space Nine, and you're going to pop out in another quadrant of the galaxy. And because, okay, so what on earth, how did God talk to Joshua? Even if you say a very rich historical assumption about those passages, what does that look like? And what does it mean that, why in the 19th century did we suddenly have all sorts of conscience issues about slavery and oppressive of the working class? And why did Dickens grow his conscience? Why did it take Jesus 300 years to conquer the Roman Empire, and he did it through the proxies of his church? And I mean, these questions just never end. And so I want you to continue, because you're on the hunt, you're on the path, you're going to dig up great things, you're going to make contributions to the world and to the conversation. I think
need a bigger bookshelf. That's what I need.
Yeah, and you're going to get a bigger bookshelf. But along the path, if you don't take cheap shortcuts and do what's expedient, you will become wise, and you will become a capable tool in God's hands, and you will bless the world. So, and that's why, you're quite right to sort of, call me on my dismissive rat stories and dog in the Dominican Republic stories, because the world would be better if I had a house in the Dominican Republic where rats wouldn't come in, because killing rats isn't much of a solution. Mm-hmm. But these issues that are involved in these questions are enormous, and the truth is, when you start to wrestle with them, you're wrestling with the same questions as Bultmann and Barth, and all of the theologians for the last 200-300 years. And then someone might say, why are you wrestling? Why are those questions different for Bultmann and Barth than they were for Augustine? And then you read Augustine carefully and you realize, oh, he was wrestling with some of these things too, but sort of differently. Well, why are they different between Augustine and Calvin and Schleiermacher?
Can I ask you a question about
Sure.
About that? Do you think it'd be worthwhile to study Aristotle and Plato when it comes to those things? Because I'm reading Confessions with a couple people right now, and I think I'm getting lost on a lot of the Neoplatonist stuff. Like I think I'm recognizing that it's there, but same thing with Thomas Aquinas. I just read a G.K. Chesterton book on Thomas Aquinas, and like most of that stuff was lost on me. And I've read Martin Luther, and I've read plenty of Calvin and Martin Luther now, to know that even though that they didn't like the quote unquote pagan philosophers, that they were influenced by them.
Yep. What is that saying? Philosophy is Plato. Everything else is footnotes.
Alfred North Whitehead.
Yeah. The deeper you go into this stuff, you learn things. You make progress. I mean, if it's not a fruitless endeavor, but it is a never-ending endeavor, which is why, again, it's my justification for life of the age to come, because these things are worth pursuing, and there's joy in their pursuit, and our little lifetimes are insufficient. We're only getting just a little taste of them. And so I think the universe would be a far sadder place if in fact we're not given the time to pursue these things. And I see this stuff as this is, if in the scientific revolution they were pursuing knowledge of God, well, you're clearly pursuing knowledge of God when you're studying this stuff. And God is in a sense saying, here I am, further up and further in. Come and know me better. And someone might say, yeah, but there's a lot of pagans and evil people and slave owners and, there's all kinds of horrible people. Oh, yeah, there are. But God sent his son to live with horrible people. And in the promise that horrible people might stop being quite so horrible. And Jesus is the way to that. So, no, you're doing well. Good questions.
Thank you.
Yeah. Wow. The time has flown. Look at the time. And now I'm going to sit down with Rick, and Rick's going to say, Paul, we're getting behind again. But I don't know. I'm having fun. I hope this is worthwhile for you guys too. I do feel like a terribly selfish person often with this stuff because I'm having great fun, but I don't know if I'm doing anything for you. So anyway, any last comments or questions from the chat before I instruct Rick to end the transmission?
Yeah, I'd just like to say that these are unbelievably helpful for me. So thank you for doing them.
Good. Well, at least for you and for me, then there's two of us, and I want to say thanks to James. I think he's gone already, but and I really do have to get James and Joey, and we really need a woman in the conversation too about this, because these questions about marriage, and finding your way through that, it's so hard. It's to live. It's a challenge to live a good life. And your lives will always fall short in one way or another. And there's nowhere near enough time, and you have nowhere near enough strength or smarts or wisdom to actually get everything right. Not even close. But I think we live in a wonderful time and a wonderful place where even in the struggle and journey, there is glory to be had and glory to be seen and goodness to be known, along with tears and bitter, painful losses. That's what life is like. So anyway, thank you all for joining us. And Rick, you can end transmission.